My name is Beverly, and at 32, I thought I understood family loyalty. I had worked hard to build a life I could rely on, senior accountant at one of Chicago's most respected firms, a modest apartment in Lincoln Park with a lake view. I treated myself to after years of discipline, savings carefully stacked for the future. I had always been the steady one, the child who followed the rules while my older brother Troy, 3 years my senior, glowed in the spotlight our parents held over him. Troy was the golden child, handsome, charismatic, quick with a joke and a smile, capable of charming anyone in minutes. Our parents celebrated his football games with parties, while my Northwestern scholarship was met with a dinner at Olive Garden. I learned early that his smallest victories were fireworks, while mine were obligations. Even into adulthood, the pattern remained. He lived in apartments he couldn't afford, drove cars well beyond his means, and bounced from one sales job to another, always convinced the next would finally make him rich. He borrowed thousands from me over the years with grand promises of repayment that never came. The last loan, $5,000 to cover his rent after a layoff, remains unpaid. Still, I kept hoping he would change. That hope dimmed the night he introduced us to Vanessa, a woman he claimed came from Chicago's upper crust. Blonde hair, designer dresses, photographs of charity galas and fine dining, it all looked convincing enough. He told us her father ran a powerful real estate firm, her mother sat on prestigious boards, and her family had expectations for anyone she might marry: financial stability, a respectable career, and above all, a proper home in the right neighborhood. Troy latched onto that vision, determined to rise to the image he believed Vanessa's family demanded. At our monthly Sunday dinner, he paraded photos of a house, 5 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, marble counters, a pool, and hot tub in the backyard. Price tag, $850,000. Mom's eyes shone with pride, Dad nodded with approval, and Troy basked in their praise. Something in his gaze unsettled me, though, the way he kept watching me like I was the missing piece to his puzzle. Later, as we cleared dishes, he suggested lunch together that week, eyes sharp with a purpose he didn't voice. I agreed, uneasy. When his text arrived the next morning, inviting me to Maple and Ash, one of the priciest steakhouses in downtown Chicago, my suspicions hardened. Troy never spent that kind of money without expecting something in return. I met him there anyway. He greeted me in a designer suit, cologne heavy in the air, insisting on ordering expensive wine I refused to drink. Over Wagyu steak he barely tasted, he finally revealed his plan. The bank had rejected his loan applications. His credit score was too low, his job history too unstable. But, he explained with practiced charm, all he needed was my signature. A cosigner with strong credit and income.
Just a formality, he said.
He promised he'd make every payment, that once he was working with Vanessa's father, money wouldn't be a problem. I told him no. Co-signing wasn't a formality. It meant being legally responsible for nearly $1 million of debt if he failed, tying my future to his recklessness for decades. He insisted I didn't believe in him, that I'd always thought I was better, that he finally had a chance at happiness and I was standing in his way. I stayed firm. His voice rose in the restaurant, his anger drawing stares, until he finally stormed out, leaving me with the bill he'd never intended to pay. By the next morning my phone rang with our mother's voice, accusing and bewildered. Troy had told them his version of events, framing me as selfish for refusing a simple signature. They couldn't understand why I wouldn't help my brother. My explanations, that he was 35, not a struggling young man, that this wasn't a modest starter home but a luxury mansion, bounced off their disappointment. They insisted Vanessa's family expected certain standards, that I should be more supportive. Soon my father was calling too, echoing the same pressure. Texts from Troy poured in, accusing me of ruining his future, of forcing him to lie to Vanessa's family, of keeping him from happiness. Then came a message from an unknown number, Vanessa herself. She wrote that Troy was heartbroken, that her parents were questioning whether his family was as supportive as he claimed, and she urged me to reconsider. I didn't reply. Her intrusion only sharpened my sense of how desperate Troy had become. I confided in my best friend Lauren, who reminded me of her cousin Sarah, who had co-signed for a boyfriend's business loan and ended up bankrupt after he disappeared. "This is exactly that kind of disaster," Lauren warned.
I knew she was right.
Still, the pressure mounted. At the next Sunday dinner, the atmosphere was suffocating. My parents greeted me stiffly, Troy smirked from a seat, and we ate in heavy silence. Finally, he announced he had alternative financing options, his voice sharp, his eyes locked on mine. He declared he would get the house by any means necessary. The words chilled me, more threat than declaration, but I dismissed them as drama. 2 weeks later, at work, I got a call from my mother in a panic. My father had fallen in the bathroom, she said, and couldn't get up. The paramedics were 20 minutes out. Terrified, I rushed from the office, speeding through traffic, heart pounding at the thought of Dad injured on the floor. When I arrived at their house, I found his car parked outside. Relief until I stepped inside. My father sat comfortably in his recliner, my mother calm at his side. Troy stood by the fireplace, smug. And seated across from them were 3 men in suits and a blonde woman I recognized from photos as Vanessa. I froze, realizing I'd been lured here under false pretenses. My mother apologized weakly, saying Troy insisted this was the only way to get me there. One lawyer introduced himself as Philip Donovan, with his associates. They were there to finalize a power of attorney, making me my parents' financial guardian. Confused, I asked why this was happening, and Troy explained smoothly that Mom and Dad were aging, that their assets, including their fully paid house worth $400,000, needed to be managed. As an accountant, I was the logical choice. But then came the truth. The documents, he admitted, would give me authority not just to manage their finances, but to approve loans against their property. In other words, he wanted to use their home as collateral for his mortgage. The realization hit me like a blow. He hadn't just schemed to use my name. Now he was manipulating our parents, pulling them into his web with lawyers and paperwork they barely understood. I looked directly at him, asking if this was really about putting their house at risk for his mansion. He faltered, then recovered with that familiar charm, spinning it as a win-win. I could protect our parents. They could help him secure his future with Vanessa. My parents looked bewildered, confessing Troy had told them it was routine estate planning, nothing more. They hadn't even read the fine print before signing preliminary documents. Anger burned in my chest. Vanessa finally spoke, insisting her father's company would ensure Troy's stability. But I'd begun doubting her story. If her family was so wealthy, why couldn't they help? She coolly replied that her parents believed in self-sufficiency. The lawyers pushed forward, urging signatures, even mentioning a notary waiting outside. I stood, refusing to play along, calling it what it was, fraud. My brother sneered, accusing me again of selfishness, but I pressed harder, pointing out his debts, his missed payments, the reality banks had already seen. The lawyers shifted uncomfortably. My father, to my surprise, raised his hand to silence Troy and agreed I was right. We needed to speak as a family. When Troy and the lawyers reluctantly stepped into the kitchen, I leveled with my parents. Patiently, gently, I explained how dangerous this was. Then I called a lawyer I trusted, Sofia Rodriguez, who specialized in elder law. After reviewing the documents, she confirmed my fears. Troy was manipulating them into giving him broad financial powers, their home at risk. While she prepared to intervene, I dug deeper. In their bank files, I discovered new credit cards in my father's name, already carrying balances, plus multiple inquiries for loans. Someone, Troy, had been using his identity. My phone buzzed with Sophia's message. What she saw was elder financial abuse. Don't let them sign anything else. My stomach sank as I realized how far Troy had already gone. To make matters worse, I began researching Vanessa. The glamorous image Troy painted crumbled quickly. Her father wasn't a real estate mogul. He owned a landscaping company that had gone bankrupt. She herself had debts and evictions on her record. The fantasy Troy had sold us, that he was marrying into wealth, was nothing but lies. Sharing these truths with my parents was devastating, but it broke through their denial. They finally saw the danger they were in. the son they had shielded for too long turning into a threat to everything they had worked for. Together with Sophia, we froze their credit, revoked the preliminary authorizations, and prepared a cease and desist letter against Troy. But I knew he wouldn't back down easily. We decided to confront him formally, on our terms. We invited him back, with Vanessa and his lawyers, for what he assumed was reconsideration. Instead, I greeted them with evidence. I had prepared a presentation, projected onto my parents' television. I began with Troy's financial records, $76,000 in credit card debt, months behind on car payments, a credit score so low no bank would touch him. Then I revealed the accounts opened in our father's name, complete with logins traced to Troy's IP address and his phone number listed as contact. It was identity theft, plain and simple, a crime carrying heavy prison terms. The lawyers whispered nervously, Vanessa grew pale, and my parents sat in stunned silence. Then I revealed the lies about Vanessa's family, showing the truth of her bankrupt father's landscaping company, her debts, her evictions. Vanessa turned on Troy in fury, realizing she too had been deceived. She stormed out, disgusted, leaving him to squirm under the weight of his own lies. The lawyers excused themselves, withdrawing their representation, urging him to seek criminal defense counsel. I delivered the final blow. A report had already been filed with the Financial Crimes Division and the Elder Abuse Prevention Unit. Still, I offered a way forward. A document, drafted with Sophia, that required Troy to close the fraudulent accounts, repay what he owed, attend financial counseling, and cease any attempt to exploit our parents. If he complied, we might avoid pressing criminal charges.
Cornered, defeated, he signed.
The golden child who had always charmed his way out of everything finally sat small and broken, stripped of illusions. My parents, though hurt, were resolute. For the first time, they refused to enable him. They told him they loved him, but love didn't mean covering up his destruction. It meant consequences, and this time he would face them. In the months that followed, the path was rough but necessary. My parents and I established proper legal protections for their assets, with me as their legitimate guardian. They began counseling, recognizing at last how their endless rescuing had crippled Troy's ability to grow. We thought we were showing love, my mother admitted, but we were teaching him he never had to face consequences. My father struggled, but even he saw the truth. Providing for children sometimes means letting them stand on their own. Troy entered a diversion program, avoided jail only because our parents withheld pressing charges, but endured wage garnishment and repayment plans that will haunt him for years. He moved into a small studio apartment, took a modest job at a hardware store, and began financial literacy classes. He was angry, resistant, but slowly reality broke through. Vanessa, surprisingly, reached out later, wanting to understand the mess she had been part of. We met, and I saw her clearly for the first time, not as the trophy Troy had paraded, but as another victim of his lies. She admitted she'd loved him, but couldn't live with his deceit. We've since become friends, bound by the strange truth that both of us were betrayed by the same man. And me? I've had to face my own resentments, the years of being overlooked, the constant weight of responsibility, the anger at my parents' favoritism. Therapy has helped me see that saying no wasn't selfish, it was survival. That enabling isn't kindness, and that family loyalty doesn't mean sacrificing yourself for someone else's destruction. 6 months later, our family is still healing. My brother is no longer the golden child, but a man slowly rebuilding from ashes. My parents are learning to love us both without comparison, to see us as we truly are. And I've learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the most loving word in the world is no.